December 1944. Louisiana, United States. A gray army convoy rolls down a dirt road between endless fields of winter corn. Inside, 50 captured German soldiers sit shoulder to shoulder, dirty, exhausted, silent. The war in Europe still rages, but for them, it's already over. Their uniforms are torn, their boots caked with French mud. They clutch metal canteens and ration tins, not knowing where they are being taken. Some think this is England. Others whisper they are heading for execution. They were told America was a land of monsters, where prisoners would be beaten, starved, or paraded through streets as trophies. That's what Nazi propaganda had promised them. But as the convoy turns off the highway, the world outside looks ordinary. Farmhouses, children waving. A man on a tractor lifting his hat as the trucks pass. One young soldier mutters, "They wave, like we're not enemies." The truck stops at a gate marked Camp Ruston. A tall guard in a clean uniform checks a clipboard, then calls out, "Welcome to your new home, gentlemen." Gentlemen. The word catches in their ears. They're marched through a gate, but instead of concrete or cages, they see wooden barracks lined in neat rows, a baseball diamond, a small chapel, and a canteen with a sign reading open hours, 12 to 4. No shouting. No dogs. No hatred. One German sergeant whispers, "This is a prison?" At the mess hall, an American sergeant stands behind the counter and serves them a hot meal. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, buttered corn, white bread, and apple pie. Each plate is identical to the ones the American soldiers carry. The prisoners look at one another in disbelief. A young man named Dieter takes a bite, then another. He mutters, "Warm food. Fresh." He hasn't eaten anything like it since Tunisia. In the corner, a radio hums, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. Outside, guards laugh and toss a baseball between shifts. For the first time since capture, the Germans begin to relax. Not because they feel safe, but because they're confused. After dinner, they're handed cigarettes and small bottles of Coca-Cola. They stare at the labels, the bright red color, the fizz, the smell of sugar. One soldier shakes his head. "American poison," he jokes weakly, then takes a sip. He freezes. "Sweet. Cold. Real." Another laughs for the first time in months. "They give this to prisoners?" The guard grins. "We give it to everyone." The Germans exchange glances, disbelief mixed with curiosity. In their world, the enemy was cruel, uncivilized, a nation of greed and chaos. Here they are fed, respected, even greeted with kindness. One of them writes in his diary that night, "They treat us as if we were guests, not captives. If this is America, then everything we were told is a lie." Later, in the barracks, another prisoner, once a loyal Nazi, whispers, "If our people could see this, they would stop fighting." Outside, a soft wind moves across the camp. The floodlights hum, casting long shadows of barbed wire across the grass. Inside those wires, something extraordinary has begun. Not a rebellion, not an escape, but a quiet war inside the mind. Because as the soldiers sleep, full and warm for the first time in years, they can't shake one question that won't let them rest. If the enemy treats us like men, were we fighting monsters or were we becoming them? They didn't know it yet, but America's greatest weapon wasn't a bomb, a tank, or a rifle. It was a meal, served with kindness. In the early months of 1944, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across the United States, from the pine forests of Mississippi to the farmlands of Iowa, the deserts of Arizona, and the rolling plains of Texas. They came in convoys and troopships, captured in North Africa and Normandy, still believing they'd be punished or executed. Instead, they entered a system governed by something they had nearly forgotten: rules. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required prisoners to be treated humanely, fed, clothed, sheltered, and given medical care equal to that of the soldiers guarding them. But America didn't just follow the rules. It over-delivered on them. POWs were examined by U.S. Army doctors. Wounds dressed. Teeth fixed. Tuberculosis cases isolated and treated. Many received the best medical attention of their lives. Their rations? The exact same as American troops. Bacon, bread, beans, butter, even coffee and sugar. Luxuries unheard of in war-torn Europe. One German officer later said, "We expected punishment. Instead they gave us breakfast." At Camp McCain in Mississippi, POWs were issued new uniforms, khaki with the letters PW stenciled in black, but they were clean, pressed, and comfortable. They were even given razors, soap, and toothpaste. For many, it was the first time they'd felt human since the war began. One guard recalled, "They stood at attention when I entered. I said, 'You can sit.' They didn't understand, No officer had ever told them that before. Another prisoner wrote in his diary, "We couldn't believe the guards called us, sir. We were the defeated ones." Inside the camps, life was strangely organized, orderly, efficient, almost civilized. There were libraries stocked with English and German books, newspapers delivered weekly, even music rooms where prisoners played violins, flutes, and harmonicas. The American Red Cross brought paper, pencils, and art supplies. Prisoners painted landscapes, carved wood figurines, wrote letters home. At Camp Algona, Iowa, the Germans built an entire nativity scene out of plaster, full-size figures painted with care, later donated to the local church. It still stands there today. Evenings brought film screenings in makeshift theaters. POWs watched Gone with the Wind and Casablanca, their faces flickering in black and white light. One remembered thinking, if America can afford this, how can they ever lose? That question wasn't just curiosity, it was the beginning of doubt. Because the men who had been told they were fighting savages now saw civility where they expected cruelty. At first, they thought it might be propaganda, that the guards were acting kind for psychological warfare. But the consistency broke through. Every morning, food. Every evening, respect. Every Sunday, rest. It wasn't an act. This was America's quiet strategy. Win the war without hatred. The humane treatment wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. U.S. officials believed that if German soldiers were treated decently, they'd return home as witnesses, proof that democracy wasn't weakness but strength. At Camp Swift in Texas, one American captain told his men, "Every kind word you give them is another bullet we don't have to fire later." And he was right. Slowly, disbelief turned into reflection. Letters began to pass between the POWs and their families in Germany. They described America's fields, its music, its order, but most of all, its fairness. One wrote, "They treat us not as enemies but as men. Perhaps this is why they are winning." The prisoners didn't realize it yet, but their indoctrination was cracking, not from interrogation but from kindness. The Reich had painted America as barbaric, divided, weak. But here, inside the fences, they found a civilization that was everything they were told it wasn't. A young guard at Camp Huntsville remembered seeing a German officer standing by the fence at sunset, staring out at the open road. He asked, "You miss home?" The officer replied, "I miss believing in it." That evening, as the camp lights flickered on, the men inside their bunks lay awake, hearing the distant echo of laughter from the guards outside. And for the first time, many began to wonder, not if they had lost the war but if they had ever been fighting for the right side at all. They had been taught America was barbaric. The lie began to crumble. Morning came early behind the fences. At dawn, the bugle sounded, and the German prisoners of war stepped out of their barracks into the soft light of an American sunrise. Each camp ran with military precision. Roll call at 6 a.m., breakfast at 7 o'clock. But there were no screams, no whip cracks, no punishment squads. The guards were firm, not cruel. Orders were followed because they made sense, not because disobedience meant pain. Inside Camp Swift, Texas, the POWs lined up for eggs, bread, oatmeal, and coffee. The smell of hot food drifted across the field, carried by the same breeze that rustled the American flag at the gate. After breakfast, men were assigned to workshops. Some worked in sawmills, others in bakeries or carpentry sheds. The U.S. Army allowed them to build furniture, fix tools, even carve wood for local churches. Every man earned small wages, 8 cents a day, redeemable in the camp canteen for soap, cigarettes, or chocolate. It wasn't freedom, but it felt close. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, the mornings echoed with hammering and laughter. Prisoners repaired roofs, planted vegetables, and mended uniforms. In the evenings they played soccer, Germany versus the rest of Europe. Sometimes even the guards joined in, tossing their caps to the sidelines and shouting encouragement. Under the hot southern sun, uniforms faded from gray to tan, and men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler now played sport with Americans who smiled at them. And at Camp Algona, Iowa, the war began to blur into something different. The prisoners there built one of the most remarkable pieces of wartime art, a full nativity scene carved by hand from plaster, complete with life-size figures of Mary, Joseph, and the infant Christ. Each figure was painted with such care that when Christmas came, the local townspeople were invited inside the wire to see it. The Americans were stunned. The Germans were proud. For one night, the fences didn't seem to exist. Letters home painted the same picture: disbelief, gratitude, and confusion. "We eat better here than we did in France," one wrote. "The guards laugh with us. They play music. They are not monsters." These letters passed through censors and still reached Germany. And with every word, they carried quiet evidence that the world their leaders had described didn't exist. Music filled the camps too. At Camp Swift, an orchestra formed, violins made from scrap wood, drums from barrels, flutes carved from old pipes. They played Beethoven, Mozart, even American jazz. Guards and prisoners stood side by side during performances, some clapping along, others lost in thought. For many POWs, the hardest battles were no longer fought with guns but with conscience. At night, as they sat around makeshift tables writing home, the conversations turned uneasy. If this is how they treat us, one man asked, then who are the barbarians? Another replied quietly, perhaps we were. It was a question few dared to ask out loud before. By 1945, the rhythm of camp life had become strangely normal. Days flowed into weeks, weeks into months. The sound of saws and laughter mixed with the hum of American radios. But beneath that calm routine, guilt began to grow. One soldier confided to a chaplain, we were taught to hate them. And yet they feed us, care for us, let us write home. I don't know what to believe anymore. Another wrote in his journal, if this is defeat, I do not fear it. Inside those fences, America was winning a war far beyond the battlefield, the war for the German mind. Each meal, each handshake, each act of decency chipped away at the walls built by years of propaganda. And for the first time, many began to see that cruelty had never been strength, it had been fear. As night fell, the barracks filled with the sounds of harmonicas and low voices singing old songs of home. Outside, the guards leaned against the fence, listening. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling. Are we the villains? One prisoner whispered in the dark. Or were we just told to be? The camp lights flickered on, throwing long shadows across the barbed wire, a quiet reminder that even inside captivity, freedom was beginning to take root in their minds. Summer, 1944. The war in Europe was still raging, but in the middle of America, another battle was quietly being won, not with bullets but with kindness. The sun beat down over the fences of Camp Swift, Texas. The fields shimmered with heat. Inside, the prisoners lined up for what they thought would be another ordinary day, another roll call, another meal, another routine under the same unblinking watchtower. But that day something different happened. A truck rolled in carrying wooden barrels packed in dry ice. The guards unloaded them carefully, steam rising in the heat. And behind them, boxes filled with glass bottles, the kind the prisoners had seen only in old advertisements, never in real life. Coca-Cola. The guards wheeled the barrels toward the canteen where a sign read, Summer treats, everyone welcome. The word, everyone, made the prisoners glance at each other. Surely not them. But the American sergeant smiled. Come on, boys. You've earned it. Inside, fans buzzed overhead. The air smelled like sugar and vanilla. Ice cream, real ice cream, piled into metal trays. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. Cold mist curling in the air. The prisoners hesitated, unsure. One whispered, it must be a trick. Another said quietly, they want to test us, to see who will take it. But the guard just shrugged, scooping another cone. You'll melt faster than the ice cream if you keep standing there. The first man stepped forward. He took a cone, the cold shocking his hand. He stared at it, pale white, soft, impossible. Then he tasted it. His eyes widened. He laughed, a deep, startled laugh that turned heads. It's real, he said in disbelief. Cold, sweet, real. Others followed. Soon the room filled with cautious grins and muffled chuckles. For the first time since their capture, they weren't soldiers or enemies or even prisoners. They were just men eating ice cream on a hot day. Then came the Coca-Cola. The bottles hissed as the caps popped off. The fizz rose, bubbles catching the light. The Germans held them up, confused. One soldier said later in his memoir, I thought they were trying to trick us. No one gives Coke to a prisoner. But they drank, slowly at first, then with wonder. The cold sweetness burned their throats and flooded their senses. It was the taste of everything they'd been told to hate. Around them, American guards leaned against tables, laughing and talking about baseball, girlfriends, and letters from home. Someone fed a coin into a jukebox, and the room filled with music, swing, trumpets, and voices that sounded like happiness itself. Soon the guards were teaching the prisoners how to toss a baseball, showing them the curve of a pitch, the sound of a bat cracking against wood. In minutes, laughter replaced the sound of orders. The air filled with conversation, broken English, broken German, but perfect understanding. It was not a propaganda film. It was real. One POW later wrote, they gave us Coca-Cola and ice cream. They played us music. I realized then, everything we were told was wrong. Another recalled, "We had been taught to believe Americans were cruel, lazy, godless. But their cruelty was kindness, their laziness was patience, and their God was freedom." That day changed something invisible inside the fences. The men didn't lose their loyalty overnight, but they began to see cracks in the world they had believed in. Every smile, every shared joke, every cold sip of Coke became proof that their image of the enemy was a lie. A prisoner named Franz wrote in his notebook that night, "In Germany we were told that mercy was weakness. Today I saw mercy stronger than any weapon." As the sun set over the camp, music drifted from the canteen. Guards and prisoners sat under the same sky, separated by wire but united in something far greater: curiosity, laughter, and disbelief. In that moment the war paused. The world paused. And somewhere deep inside, propaganda lost its power. Because no matter how loyal they were to the Reich, no amount of ideology could explain ice cream on a summer day or Coca-Cola shared between supposed enemies. That night, a sergeant wrote in his journal, "We didn't lecture them. We just showed them who we are." And the prisoners began to whisper quietly in the barracks, "If this is the enemy, then what were we fighting for?" For the first time they began to doubt the Reich, not from defeat but from desert. By late 1944, the barbed wire fences no longer felt like cages. They had become borders between two worlds. Inside, the men who once wore the eagle and swastika lived under a flag they had been taught to hate. Outside, America kept showing them a version of strength they'd never imagined. As the war dragged on, the United States faced a new challenge: labor shortages. Millions of American men were overseas fighting in Europe and the Pacific, and farms across the country stood half empty. The answer came from behind the fences. The War Department began releasing German prisoners on supervised work details. They were sent to help rebuild roads, harvest crops, repair barns, and work in sawmills. Each truck that rolled out of a camp gate was a quiet act of trust. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, groups of 30 men were assigned to cotton fields owned by local families. At first, farmers watched from a distance, wary. But by the end of the week, they were sharing sandwiches and lemonade under the same trees. One farmer's daughter later recalled, "They were polite, respectful, always saying thank you. My father said, they work harder than most of our own boys ever did." Another account from Camp Aliceville, Alabama described how POWs harvested peanuts alongside American laborers. They sang songs, the Germans in rough harmony, the Americans laughing at the unfamiliar words. At noon, everyone ate together. When one farmer offered a prisoner a slice of apple pie, the man froze. "For me?" he asked in broken English. The farmer nodded. The German took a bite and smiled shyly. "You treat us like neighbors." That simple sentence echoed across dozens of camps. In Iowa, prisoners at Camp Algona helped rebuild barns destroyed by storms. Farmers paid them in produce, baskets of eggs, milk, and bread. Many POWs sent these gifts to nearby orphanages rather than keeping them. Small acts of compassion became contagious. In Texas, children began waving to the prisoners' trucks as they passed. Some even snuck baseballs through the wire, asking the enemy to throw them back. Letters from American townspeople began arriving at the camps, handwritten notes saying thank you for your help on the farm, God bless you, come back after the war and visit us. And some of them did. Decades later, local families still told stories of the German boys, who came back as free men, bringing wives and children to meet the people who had once guarded them. But beneath these friendships, a quieter struggle grew: guilt. Inside the barracks, conversations turned to the lives they had led before capture. One man whispered, "How can our enemy treat us better than our own officers ever did?" Another replied, "Because perhaps they fight for something real." At first, others dismissed such talk as weakness, but the thought kept returning, a splinter they couldn't remove. They remembered the beatings from Nazi supervisors, the starvation rations, the endless lectures about racial purity. Here, under the stars of an enemy sky, they were treated as human beings. A prisoner at Camp Swift wrote in his diary, "Back home we saluted fear. Here we salute respect. They win because they don't need to shout." There were even small, forbidden stories of affection. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, a few local women taught English to the prisoners under Red Cross supervision. The classes were proper, polite, but sometimes eyes lingered too long, smiles came too easily. One woman later admitted, "They were lonely and so were we." It wasn't romance, it was recognition. Those moments never became scandals. They were whispered memories tucked away when the war ended. For the Americans, the kindness was duty. For the Germans, it was revelation. At night, when the floodlights flickered on and the day's work was done, The men sat outside their barracks, listening to crickets. Cigarettes glowed in the dark. Conversations drifted between guilt and wonder. Some talked of their mothers back home, hungry and afraid. Others imagined what Germany would look like when they returned, if there would even be a home to go back to. A young corporal named Klaus wrote in his journal, "The Americans guard us with rifles, yet I have never felt freer." One night, during a camp church service, a chaplain read aloud from the Gospel of Matthew, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Afterward, a prisoner asked, "Do Americans truly believe this?" The chaplain answered softly, "We try." It was a simple reply, but it haunted the man for the rest of his life. By 1945, most camps had become small, self-sustaining communities. There were schools, theaters, sports leagues, and orchestras. The POWs even staged plays in German and English, performing Shakespeare and Goethe for mixed audiences of guards and civilians. The transformation was remarkable. The barbed wire still stood, but inside it, men learned civility from those they had called enemies. Some guards admitted they'd grown fond of the men they watched. One wrote home, "They're just like us, only tired." When word of Germany's collapse reached the camps, reactions were mixed. Some wept quietly, others stared into space. A few celebrated, not the fall of their homeland but the fall of the fear that had ruled it. They knew their lives would soon change again. The fences that had become boundaries of safety would soon open, and beyond them waited ruins. But inside they had already begun rebuilding something invisible: trust. One American lieutenant said years later, "We didn't try to re-educate them with lectures. We just let them see how a free nation behaves." He was right. The war for their minds was nearly over, and America had won it without a single weapon. As one POW wrote before his repatriation, "I lost my country, my pride, and my illusions. But I found something greater: dignity." When the gates finally opened and the prisoners lined up to leave, many looked back one last time. The fences glimmered in the morning light, the same wires that once divided hate from understanding. Some raised their hands in farewell. Others whispered quiet thanks to the guards. And as the trucks rolled away, the Americans watching from the gate felt a strange ache, because somehow, in the heart of war, both sides had found something worth keeping. They had lost the war but found something else: dignity. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the camps grew quiet. The same loudspeakers that once blared roll calls now carried a single announcement: Germany had surrendered. For the prisoners, the words were both liberation and loss. Some cheered, others wept. But most just stood still, unsure how to feel. They had lived through years of captivity, yet those years had become a strange kind of sanctuary. Behind the wire they had food, structure, dignity. Beyond it waited the unknown, a homeland they no longer recognized. By the end of 1945, repatriation began. Trains rolled across the countryside, loaded with men in khaki uniforms marked PW. At the stations, American guards shook their hands. Many said good luck. Some said, "Come back someday." But few were smiling on the inside. One German corporal looked out the train window at the fields of Texas fading into the horizon and murmured, "We're going back to ruins." He wasn't wrong. Their journey home crossed oceans. Prisoners were loaded onto troopships bound for Europe, packed shoulder to shoulder but quiet, reflective. They watched the American coastline disappear behind them. The clean camps, the warm food, the laughter, the strange civility they'd come to rely on. As the waves grew colder, the realization set in. They were leaving safety for devastation. Weeks later, the first ships arrived in Le Havre, France, and the men began their trek into the broken heart of Europe. Every step home was a shock. Germany was unrecognizable. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden lay in ashes. Entire neighborhoods flattened, cathedrals reduced to black skeletons. Factories stood silent. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Children scavenged in rubble for coal and bread. The once proud Reich they had fought for was gone. Its banners burned, its leaders dead or captured, its borders split among the victors. The men who had been treated humanely in enemy hands now walked through the ruins of their own making. At the checkpoints, they saw Soviet soldiers in Berlin, British convoys in the west, and American jeeps patrolling highways that used to belong to the Wehrmacht. There was no salute now. No command. Only silence. One POW wrote, "We left America as prisoners and came home as strangers." The irony was painful. The country they had been told would enslave them had fed them. The country they had sworn to defend had starved itself to death. In Hamburg, a group of returning POWs found their families living in bomb shelters. One man's wife didn't recognize him. Another learned his mother had died in 1943. For many, there were no homes left to return to, only hollow streets and the ghostly echo of what used to be life. They stood in bread lines, trading American cigarettes for food, their PW uniforms now symbols of survival instead of shame. The irony deepened when they realized that in some parts of Germany food was rationed, but in the American camps they had eaten 3 meals a day. Letters began circulating between former prisoners. The enemy fed us, our homeland cannot. The Americans guarded us, now our own country cannot protect us. Those words were never meant to be bitter, they were simply true. The contrast between the two worlds became unbearable. Inside captivity they had learned order, decency, even small freedoms. Back home chaos ruled, and worse, hopelessness. In the American camps they had rebuilt towns and grown crops. In Germany they now scavenged through rubble for scraps of wood to keep warm. One soldier wrote in his journal, "It is strange to miss a prison." For some, that feeling became permanent. Many of the repatriated POWs struggled to adjust. They couldn't talk about what they had seen, not the abundance, not the kindness, not the quiet dignity of the people they had been told to despise. If they spoke of it, they risked being called traitors, sympathizers, or cowards. So they kept silent. Yet their silence changed everything. Within a few years, they began helping rebuild Germany, not with the arrogance of conquerors, but with the discipline they had learned behind American wire. They organized farms, started cooperatives, reopened schools. And when asked where they had learned such fairness, they answered simply, in the camps. It was the beginning of a quiet transformation, the birth of a different kind of patriotism, built not on hate but on humility. Some even returned to America in the 1950s, not as prisoners but as immigrants, students, and farmers. They wrote to their old guards, sent photographs of families, and thanked them for teaching them something their own regime never could: compassion. One letter to a former American captain read, "You did not beat us. You educated us." The same men who once swore loyalty to Hitler now admired the democracy they had witnessed in captivity. Their world had collapsed, but inside those fences, they had seen what could be built from order, honesty, and humanity. In 1946, as the last transport trains left the ports, an American major overseeing repatriation noted in his report, "They come home defeated but not broken. Some will rebuild Germany better than it ever was." He was right. Those men carried something new, a moral inheritance born from contradiction. They had been enemies of democracy, but democracy had treated them like men. They had been soldiers of conquest, but they returned as witnesses to compassion. Their bodies went home to Germany, but their minds carried America. They came home with an American conscience. By 1947, the fences were gone, but the lessons remained. Germany was no longer a battlefield, it was a construction site. The country was divided into occupation zones. Cities still lay in rubble, hunger still gnawed at the population, and yet, from that desolation, something unexpected began to grow. Among the millions returning home were the men who had lived for years behind American wire, men who had eaten American food, worked on American farms, read American newspapers, and seen, up close, the quiet power of democracy. They were no longer the same soldiers who had marched under the swastika. They carried with them the memory of a different kind of discipline, one built not on fear but on fairness. Many began to help rebuild not just homes and roads but ideas. In towns like Münster, Hamburg, and Würzburg, former POWs organized reconstruction brigades, using the skills they had learned in the camps: carpentry, logistics, teamwork, negotiation. They rebuilt schools, hospitals, and even theaters. And when local mayors asked how they managed such efficiency, they replied with a smile, "We learned it in America." Across post-war Germany, this quiet generation became the backbone of the new republic. They taught their children a different set of values, not blind obedience but responsibility, not nationalism but citizenship. One of them, a former Wehrmacht lieutenant from Camp Algona, later wrote in his diary, "We learned freedom behind barbed wire. We learned that respect is stronger than ideology." His words would echo decades later in speeches, books, and classrooms. Letters began to appear in American newspapers too, small paragraphs in the back pages, written by names that sounded both foreign and familiar. "To my American guards, thank you for showing us humanity when we had forgotten it." In 1948, the Marshall Plan arrived, America's economic recovery program for Europe. Factories reopened. Railroads hummed. Markets came alive again. And for many of the men who had once been POWs, it felt like the closing of a strange, full circle. The same nation that had captured them was now helping feed their families. A former prisoner from Camp Swift wrote to an old guard, "You fed us when we were the enemy. Now you feed our children." Maybe this is what victory really means. Not all could express gratitude so easily. For many, the emotions were tangled: pride, guilt, disbelief. Some had returned to nothing, their homes destroyed, families lost. They struggled to reconcile the warmth of their captors with the cold reality of their homeland. One man confessed to his wife, "I felt safer in America than here. Does that make me a coward?" She didn't answer. She simply held his hand. Historians would later call this period the silent transformation. The German POWs in America became unintentional ambassadors of democracy, carrying its principles home like invisible luggage. Even decades later, they remembered the taste of freedom more vividly than the sound of war. In small memoirs and local newspapers, they wrote about their time in captivity, not as humiliation but as education. The Americans taught us to think. They let us argue. They made us feel like men again. Some couldn't stay away. In the 1950s and 60s, many former POWs returned to the United States, not as captives but as immigrants. They bought farms, became teachers, opened bakeries. A few even revisited their old camps, now empty fields or community parks, and stood quietly where the fences once stood. One man from Bavaria, who had spent 3 years in Camp Huntsville, Texas, returned in 1961. He met the son of his former guard. Together, they walked the land where their fathers had once stood on opposite sides of the wire. The German pointed to the horizon and said, "Your father taught me how to play baseball. I taught him how to say thank you in German." Maybe that's how wars really end. Those who stayed in Germany carried the memory forward in their families. Their children grew up not with hatred but with stories of fairness, of a country that fought with kindness and conquered with respect. In schools and community halls, they spoke about the power of mercy, about how an enemy's humanity had changed them more than any speech or punishment could. They reminded the next generation that strength is not in cruelty, but in restraint. And for all their nostalgia, they never forgot the guilt of what they had once believed and the shame of realizing it too late. That mix of gratitude and remorse became the moral DNA of post-war Germany, the invisible foundation beneath its democracy. One former POW summarized it best in a letter to his son. "I learned what it means to lose, not on the battlefield but in the heart. Yet losing made me free. The Americans gave me that gift." By 1950, Germany was no longer the Germany they had left behind in 1939. The flags were different, the leaders gone, the slogans forgotten. But in the quiet hearts of men who had once seen the inside of an American camp, something new had taken root, belief not in conquest but in character. We learned freedom behind barbed wire. Those words were no longer just a confession. They were a legacy. The barbed wire was gone, but the lesson it left behind would shape a nation for generations. Nostalgia mixed with guilt, not for defeat but for having discovered too late what victory really meant. By the time the last German POW returned home, the war had already become history, yet its quietest victories were only beginning to unfold. The world remembered the bombs, the generals, the battles that filled maps and textbooks. But what few realized then was that one of the most powerful campaigns of the entire war had never been fought on the battlefield. It had been fought in dining halls, workshops, and canteens. It had been fought with music, patience, and mercy. It was the psychological warfare of kindness. Historians would later study it as a phenomenon, a moral experiment that reshaped not only Germany's defeated soldiers, but the ethics of warfare itself. Before 1941, prisoners of war were often treated as burdens, sometimes as subhuman. In Europe and Asia, cruelty was routine. Starvation, forced labor, and execution were expected. But in the United States, a different idea took root. You don't win a man's loyalty by breaking him, you win it by showing him what freedom looks like. The U.S. Army's approach to German POWs became a blueprint for modern humanitarian law. Officers saw it not as charity but as strategy. They believed every act of fairness, every meal served, every letter allowed, every moment of dignity granted, was a message to the world. And history proved them right. The German soldiers who returned home didn't come back as conquerors, but as witnesses. Their stories spread quietly through towns and villages, testimonies of America's strange, disciplined compassion. One former prisoner told a historian, "They could have made us hate them more. Instead, they made us respect them." Another recalled, "They didn't force democracy on us. They let us see it." Decades later, sociologists coined a term for it, re-education by example. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't manipulation. It was exposure to order, equality, and self-respect. Inside those camps, the Germans learned something no ideology had ever taught them, that decency could be stronger than domination. In post-war Germany, the echoes of that lesson rippled through generations. Former POWs became teachers, engineers, mayors, and mentors. They built institutions based not on obedience but on trust, a reflection of what they had seen in their captors. As the Cold War began, the memory of those American camps became part of a larger moral conversation. What does it mean to win a war? Was victory measured in cities captured or in hearts changed? Could mercy, once considered weakness, actually be a weapon? For many historians, the answer came from the men who had lived it. In the 1980s and 1990s, documentaries began to appear: Behind Barbed Wire, The Enemy Next Door, Prisoners in Paradise. Old men with gray hair and soft voices told their stories to cameras, sometimes through tears. One said, "When I saw the concentration camp newsreels after I came home, I couldn't believe what our leaders had done. But the Americans, they treated us with honor. I could never hate them again." Another remembered a small act, a guard who shared his cigarette rations on Christmas Eve. "It was such a small thing," he said, "but it stayed with me longer than the war itself." At reunions decades later, former prisoners and American guards met again, not as enemies but as friends. They exchanged photos of families, shook hands, sometimes hugged. One guard, now in his 80s, said softly, "You were my prisoner once." The German smiled and replied, "No, you were my teacher." By the end of the century, researchers had begun calling it a moral victory, a triumph of principle over propaganda. The American treatment of POWs didn't just change lives, it changed the global standard. It influenced the Geneva Convention revisions of 1949 and later became the foundation of modern human rights protocols. Even nations once hostile to the idea began adopting similar rules, not out of goodwill but out of recognition. It worked. Because kindness, when consistent, becomes undeniable truth. The same men who had built their world on hatred returned home with something far more enduring: respect for the humanity of others. As one historian wrote, America won not just the war but the minds of its enemies. And perhaps that was the truest kind of victory, one without bloodshed, without conquest, without humiliation. When asked years later how the Americans managed to change them without ever forcing belief, a former POW answered quietly, "They didn't have to change us. They just let us see who they really were." And that, more than tanks or bombers or battles, was what endured. The barbed wire rusted away. The camps turned into playgrounds, community centers, and farmlands. But the memory remained, that strange, quiet experiment in decency that transformed hate into humility. In the end, history didn't remember their prison numbers or the fences that held them. It remembered what they learned there, that freedom cannot be taught through fear. It can only be shown through fairness. America won not just the war but the minds of its enemies. Wars are remembered for their battles, for their victories, their losses, their weapons, their generals. But history rarely remembers the moments of grace. Those quiet, human gestures, a cigarette shared, a smile through the fence, a hand extended where hatred was expected. And yet, sometimes, those are the moments that outlive the war itself. The story of the German POWs in America is not just about captivity, it's about what happens when humanity becomes a weapon stronger than bullets. They arrived as enemies. They had been told Americans were savages, a nation of corruption, chaos, and cruelty. But what they found behind barbed wire was order, fairness, and something even more dangerous to tyranny: decency. Behind those fences, they played music, built furniture, studied English, and wrote letters home that said things their commanders never could have imagined. They treat us like men. They feed us better than our army ever did. We are prisoners, but we are free. Those words spread quietly across the Atlantic, carried in ink and memory. And when those men returned home, they carried more than rations or relief. They carried a different understanding of freedom, one born not from surrender but from being treated as human beings again. One former prisoner, decades later, said, "I was captured by the enemy, but liberated by his kindness." That is the paradox of mercy. It disarms even the most hardened heart. The archives tell their own story now: black and white photographs of young German soldiers sitting at wooden tables, laughing, ice cream melting in paper cups, Coca-Cola bottles sweating in the summer heat. Behind them, the wire glints under the sun. Beside them, American guards stand smiling. Enemies separated by war, united by ordinary humanity. It is one of the most striking images of the 20th century, a moment where the front lines blurred and empathy won. Historians have called it America's quiet victory. Not because it was loud or strategic, but because it revealed something no propaganda could hide. That freedom wasn't a slogan. It was a way of living. They came to destroy it. They left believing in it. Years later, as those same men built families and communities in a new Germany, they taught their children what they had learned in those camps. That power built on fear will always collapse. But power built on fairness, that lasts. One of them wrote before his death, "Wars don't end when armies surrender. They end when hatred ends and not before." That line now stands etched on a memorial plaque outside what used to be Camp Algona in Iowa. Where once there was barbed wire, there are now wildflowers. Where once there were guards, there are children playing. And every summer, the town holds a small fair. They sell Coca-Cola and ice cream. Because some stories deserve to be remembered not in blood, but in sweetness. The German POWs who once came as enemies left as witnesses. Proof that mercy is not weakness, but wisdom. Proof that kindness, even in war, can be the most dangerous weapon of all. In a world at war, America's kindness became its strongest defense. And perhaps, its truest victory. If this story changed how you see history, subscribe. Because the next one will remind you that even in war, humanity can surprise us all. And maybe, that's the story we need most today.